Bold Scots have been at the forefront of changing the world of innovation throughout history. Tonight, in this special episode of the People's History Show, I'm going to introduce you to 4 Scots that changed the world in their own right. And all 4 were women. This is not a piece about Scottish women. This is about people who, regardless of their sex, influenced and changed the world we live in today, even how we look at the universe. I'm Judith Bowers, and this is the People's History Show. Coming up on tonight's show, we head to Blair Castle to explore the life of Katharine Marjory, who became Scotland's first female MP.
But she, having read Mein Kampf and so forth, knew that Hitler wasn't going to stop, and within a year was virtually proved correct.
We find out more about suffragist and Scottish doctor Elsie Inglis.
She was told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Now, she wasn't a woman to go home and sit still.
And we discover how Dundee-born Fanny Wright helped in the abolition of slavery with views that were centuries ahead of her time.
But that's really forward thinking. It's very easy to join one side in an argument. It's very difficult to see both. Sometimes only women do that.
Our First Lady was a polymath at a time when women were seldom educated, and she now even appears on a £10 note. Her name is Mary Somerville.
She is a very important person in the history of mathematics, and yet in many ways hasn't had the credit for that.
Mary Somerville was actually born in December of 1780 in Jedburgh, but she grew up here in Burnt Island, where the family home was. Her father was Vice Admiral George Fairfax, so he spent most of his life at sea. Meanwhile, Mary was left to run around the beach picking up shells and wildflowers. When her father returned from sea when she was about 10 years old, he discovered his daughter had grown into somewhat of a wild savage. He wanted his daughter to be a proper young lady, so he sent her to Miss Primrose's boarding school in Musselburgh. What made you interested in Mary Somerville?
She had no formal training in mathematics at all. And to realise that she went from someone who had been taught to count basic arithmetic, she went until she could understand and improve on the cutting-edge mathematics of the day, is a fantastic achievement.
That's an incredible brain. Mary's stint at Miss Primrose's may have been short, but it was certainly enough to give her a thirst for learning. And when she came back to Jedburgh, she found herself surrounded by a whole library of books. Unfortunately, most of them were written in Latin. But that did not deter our Mary. She decided to teach herself Latin. Then her uncle, Dr. Thomas Somerville, caught her reading his books, and he decided to help her learn to read Latin, which was very unusual at that time because men did not believe that women had the capacity to learn technical information. Mary was very fortunate that her uncle was such an enlightened man because he encouraged the young woman in her studies.
I mean, when she was young, she used to stay up at night with burning the candle, reading the book, and her mother didn't approve of this. And said, no, she mustn't do that. So they took the candle away from her. And so she would read Euclid's Elements during the day, and then she would lay in bed at night, and she would be rehearsing and thinking over in her mind how these theorems were proved. She wasn't going to give up just because they took her candle away.
When Mary was just 13 years old and flourishing into a young woman, her parents decided to move the family back here to Edinburgh. They wanted their children to get the best advantages of Edinburgh society, so Mary was sent to all sorts of balls and social engagements. She enjoyed them And she was very popular with the boys too. They referred to her as the Rose from Jedburgh. As a child growing up in Burnt Island, Mary was fascinated by the night sky. So it's no wonder that her interest in science led to astronomy.
I think it was immediately after my return to Scotland that I attempted to read Newton's Principia. I found it extremely difficult, and certainly did not understand it till I returned to it some time after, when I studied that wonderful work with great acidity, and wrote numerous notes and observations on it.
She looked at the orbit of Uranus and realised that it wasn't quite obeying what it should obey if it was only being attracted by the known planets and the Sun. That led to John Couch Adams, who then did the precise mathematical calculations and came up with a very accurate estimate of where that planet would be found.
And that planet was?
Neptune.
A lot of people didn't even know that the Earth was, round and influenced by the moon and the sun. And, most people, most common people, didn't understand any of this. Mary dedicated her life to science at a time when her contemporaries were dedicating themselves to painting, reading, sewing, and looking after their households. Mary helped change the attitudes of men towards women being educated, particularly in scientific subjects. It was her lust for learning that drove her forward, and as a result, she paved the way not just for women of science, but for women's education as well. Next, we're venturing north to delve into the life of one Dundonian whose influence stretched as far as the United States. This is where Frances Wright was born in 1795. Better known as Fanny Wright, she was the daughter of James Wright, linen manufacturer and political radical. Although it's unlikely that he had any influence on Frances, as he actually died when she was only 3 years old, leaving her an orphan. Fanny would, however, grow up to be an abolitionist, a feminist, a free thinker, and, shock horror, a divorcee in the 19th century.
She doesn't grow into becoming the abolitionist, the reformer, the changer of things. She's almost doing that from a very early age, late teens, early 20s. It's breaking convention. And, if she'd been born 70 years later, she would still be breaking convention. It's the fact that she does it so early in her life and so meaningfully and has so much impact later on that's the great thing. How she does it is because she's a very single-minded individual.
She was brought up by her aunt, who was a very well-educated lady for the time. She tutored Fanny and even introduced her to the world of philosophy. At the age of 16, Fanny moved back to Scotland to live with her great-uncle, James Milne, who was Professor of Philosophy at the Glasgow College. Just like her aunt, her great-uncle encouraged Fanny to learn more about the world and about philosophy. So it's no wonder that by the age of 18, Fanny wrote her first book, called A Few Days in Athens.
I think the interesting thing is that she amuses a lot of the men these views are very radical, almost unworkable. It's the women who are have more difficulty accepting some of the things that are being said to them by Fanny Wright. And she's willing to stand up and be accounted for on many subjects. She has an opinion and she's delighted to let you know what her opinion is.
In 1818, and aged just 23, Fanny went on her own voyage of discovery to America for the first time. What she saw there as she travelled across the country inspired her to write about the views and manners of American society.
Probably in hindsight, the abolitionist stuff in America with slavery is the one that's most relevant today, you would say. The fact that she saw both sides in all the arguments, considered what would happen to the South if they were forced to make changes. So she didn't only think of the betterment of the slaves, she was looking to how the people could be accommodated that would be no longer able to avail themselves of slaves. And that's really forward thinking. It's very easy to join one side in an argument. It's very difficult to see both. Sometimes only women do that.
Oh, I like that, Eddie. She was inspired by Robert Owen's model farms, and it prompted her to write a paper on how slaves could be freed without any impact on the income of the slave owner. To prove her point, she set up her own model farm, the Nashoba community.
These things are all ahead of her time by hundreds of years, not just by a few years. She really does break the mould in a quite spectacular way.
The final years of Fanny's life were fraught with illness. She died in 1852 after she fell on an icy staircase, leaving behind her a legacy which would influence change in slavery, the education of poor women, feminism, capitalism, and even sexual freedom. To use Fanny's own words, "Equality is the soul of liberty. There is, in fact, no liberty without it." Coming up in part 2 on this special edition of the People's History Show, we head to Blair Castle to explore the life of Katharine Marjory, who became Scotland's first female MP. And we find out more about suffragist and Scottish doctor Elsie Inglis. That really is so violent, isn't it? I mean, that one really is. That's just awful. Welcome back to the People's History Show. Coming up, we head to Blair Castle to explore the life of Katharine Marjory, who became Scotland's first female MP.
The version of Mein Kampf that was published here had been edited, and she arranged for the full version so people knew of the dangers of fascism. It wasn't what people wanted to hear, but that never shut her up.
But our next lady was a suffragist. Suffragists believed in the peaceful demonstration and education of men. Our next lady is Elsie Inglis. Elsie Inglis was born in India on the 16th of August 1864. Her father was a civil servant. When she was 14 years old, he moved his family to Edinburgh, and it's here that her story really begins. By the age of 19, Elsie had decided that she wanted to be a doctor, which was a revolutionary idea at the time because at that point women were nurses, but they weren't generally trained as doctors. But in 1887, her opportunity came when Sophia Jex-Blake opened the very first medical school for women here in Edinburgh, and Elsie was one of the first students. Elsie qualified in 1892 and got her very first job as a doctor through in London, but she was appalled at the conditions there. So 2 years later, she returned to Edinburgh and opened her own maternity hospital and a school for midwifery. Elsie was disgusted at the state of medical care, especially for women. This is what led her into a political career. However, unlike the suffragettes, Elsie was a suffragist. The suffragettes, of course, were manacling themselves to railings and protesting, sometimes violently, whereas Elsie thought the best way to protest was by educating men and taking on the roles of a man. In Elsie's case, she became, of course, a doctor.
Women are frequently written out of history, so lots of stories of women's achievements and their lives and histories just don't exist because they're discarded, not seen as very valuable, and, as I say, written out. And out of recorded history, 0.5% is in relation to women.
0.5%?
Yeah.
Today, I think a lot of women, particularly young women, have been brought up in a society which is very equal. And looking at some of these postcards, I mean, we can really see how things have changed in our society.
It's actually quite violent depictions here.
Peace at last.
Yes, and you know, women with nails through the tongues or scissors coming in to chop tongues off.
That really is so violent, isn't it? I mean, that one really is. That's just awful. That ugly mouth, why don't you shut it? If I had your tongue like this, I'd cut it.
And of course
she's got a rope around her neck as well.
Yes, exactly, just in case she tried to get away.
It was a time when, well, I mean, we were still in the First World War. Women had been left behind to do a lot of the men's jobs, a lot of the men's work, of course. And of course, people like Elsie Inglis, she had wanted to help.
She went to the War Office and basically offered her services. She was a surgeon, she was an incredibly skilled medical professional, and her offer was declined by the War Office, and she was told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Now, she wasn't a woman to go home and sit still, and the rest is very, very much history.
What she did was she raised money to have these hospitals, to pay for the staffing of them, which was all staffed by women, to pay for the actual medicines, the bandages and everything that they needed. And that's what these pins were there to raise the money for.
That's right, and with fairly limited support from home, she went and set up the hospitals for the Allies, really. So, Serbia and France, as can be seen by this little pin here, were two of the countries that they set up hospitals in, and she was certainly stationed in Serbia for much of her time serving.
Unfortunately, in the midst of her war work, Elsie contracted cancer and had to return to the UK. Sadly, on the 26th of November 1917, Elsie died, just one day after returning home. Our last lady was anti the suffrage movement, but strangely she became the first Scottish female MP. Welcome to the story of the Red Duchess, Katharine Marjory. Katharine Marjory, more commonly known as Kitty, was born on the 6th of November 1874. She was a daughter of James Henry Ramsay, 10th Baronet of Banff. She was actually tutored by her father initially before going to high school in Wimbledon and graduating from there to go to the Royal College of Music. Music was her first love, and it was at the college that she met her husband-to-be.
She and her mother had been invited here partly just as the normal round of social life, but specifically to play. Her mother sang and she played piano. So they were a fairly unlikely combination, really, because Bardi was a soldier, sort of more active, and she was more studious. But something happened, as these things do.
In July of 1899, Kitty married John George Stuart Murray and moved to this small country house. John was a military man just like his father, and soon after he and Kitty were married, he became captain of the Royal Horse Guards. A year or so after that, he set up the Scottish Horse. When the First World War came along, of course, John went and again joined the war effort, and so did Katharine.
He thought there was nothing happening. So, oh, it's quite safe, come along, So she went off in the middle of the war to South Africa, and then it became apparent that there was a bit more going on, and she did spend quite a lot of time in a convent in Johannesburg. She wasn't galloping around the plains with him. And they returned home here to the castle and set up the Red Cross Hospital here.
Which was in this very building?
It was in the ballroom, and there are pictures of the beds in the ballroom, and again of Kitty entertaining the troops, sitting at the piano, playing for the troops.
After the war itself, Katharine, by now Duchess of Atholl, continued her work, becoming involved with the establishment of the Highlands and Islands Medical Service Committee. This became a model for the NHS. In between, the suffragette movement is going on. Kitty is famously anti-suffrage at the time.
Yeah, well, her thing about it initially was that women had to get experience out in the man's world. So she was putting into action what she was preaching. She wasn't just saying, oh, women should get experience. She was getting it herself.
Because, of course, she was the very first Scottish female MP.
Yes.
And that's quite a radical thing.
Yes. And for somebody that in some ways doesn't look radical, you'd think it would have been one of the Red Clydeside women.
You would, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You know, the more militant ones that
Yes.
are right in there. But her own party eventually turned against her and accused her of being a communist, didn't they?
Yes, that was much later. In the 1930s, she really got into sort of foreign affairs. And then she started to look at things like the rise of Hitler and the fact that the version of Mein Kampf that was published here had been edited, and she arranged for the full version so people knew of the dangers of fascism. It wasn't what people wanted to hear, but that never shut her up. She kept saying that there should be rearmament. Obviously people didn't want war. They didn't really want to hear this. After the First World War, you can absolutely understand that.
It's a terrible time.
People would not want the prospect of another war. But she, having read Mein Kampf and so forth, knew that Hitler wasn't going to stop, and within a year was virtually proved correct. But by then it was too late for her, but she felt she'd done the best she could. Bardi did support her. I mean, he was never embarrassed by her or attempted to put her down. He resigned from the local constituency association as well when they were trying to get rid of her, in support of her, and was always there for her. In her last years, she was getting really forgetful, and she was heading to the train station and then not remembering where she was going and forgetting things. So in this very room there was a flat for Duchess Kitty.
Throughout her life, Kitty might not have agreed with the suffragette movement, but she also campaigned against international cruelty and was a champion for education for all. When this lady died on the 21st of October 1960, she was mourned by all she knew. Well, that's it from me for this special episode. We hope to see you soon on the People's History Show.